what's the tone that you want to like? Is it like
Hysterical. I want you to be hysterical.
no? But seriously, I don't know like how I could pull back the humor. I could usually the way we usually talk about things is usually how I am, like when you and I are talking. But that's a mix of dad jokes and
That's what I
seriousness
want.
and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. That's what I want people overhearing our conversations, basically.
Yeah. Okay. That's what I want. I thought that's what you're going for, but I just want
Yeah.
to make sure, like, if you wanted to be more like serious and professional, or more like two people with different kind of sensibilities to these things talking.
Yeah. All right, welcome to Credible Opinions, where it's our mission to bring you opinions and perspectives worth considering from folks who should know. This episode is entitled Me the People, Spotting the Authoritarian Precipice. And today's guest is Miguel Lacerna, who's a good friend of mine, but more importantly and remarkably is the chair of the History Department at UNC Chapel Hill, an acclaimed author in the area of Peruvian history. Do you like my air parentheses there?
Oh,
Acclaimed.
at least you didn't do this.
I didn't. No. It's
It's parentheses. It was almost brackets
brackets.
as opposed to air
No, I
quotes.
won't do that to you. How are you doing today, Miguel?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me here today. I'm really excited to be part of this program.
Miguel will also be a recurring host on other episodes. And now I'm going to throw the Credible Opinions disclaimer at you, and that is that all opinions expressed on Credible Opinions are correct, but are solely those of the individual and not made as representations or positions of any other person, entity, or institution. So you're off the chain now. You can say whatever you want. It's
I'm
fine.
glad you said that, because when you said chair of the history department, I'm like, I do not speak for the history department, so that's good. Yeah.
Therefore, there are no consequences to anything you say. Keep that.
No one would ever be canceled for saying something on public airways like this.
You have to be popular to be canceled.
Who said that? If, like, I think Kobe Bryant said it, like, if you're you don't have haters, then you're doing something wrong.
Um, so just need a little bit longer of an introduction. You're the author of several books, and looking at sort of the content of those, having not read any of them in their entirety, but read reviews. I'm going to call you an expert in 20th century Peruvian politics and conflict. And I want to widen the lens from civil war and insurgencies, because those things happen in the context of politics and governance. And they're not just related to domestic dynamics, but also the external dynamics of global 20th century ideologies and influences. And I think that's missed a lot of times. What is sort of your perspective on your expertise and the history and role of Peru in the 20th century and its relationship to the global dynamics that were going on?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for not putting what I do in brackets this time when you said it. I do work on 20th century Peru. I appreciated that, because I was waiting for the bracket framing.
They're coming
Uh,
like out of the top.
you can't whip them out. You got to be really selective
Just
before you
rest my
whip
hands on
out.
the table like this.
Yeah, no, thanks for that introduction. And yeah, I do look at insurgencies, politics, counterinsurgencies, political violence in particular, in Latin America, with an emphasis on the Andes and Peru. So I think the way that you described it was accurate, with or without brackets. And I do, interestingly enough, find some parallels with some of the things I've been looking at in the kind of late 20th century in Peru, and some things that we're starting to notice taking shape in the world today. And that's because, well, Peru went through a period of pretty dramatic and tragic political violence, where according to the Peruvian Truth Commission, about 70,000 people were killed in the span of about 15 to 20 years, because of the insurgency of an armed group known as the Shining Path. There were some other smaller groups that also took up arms as well, but the Shining Path was like the real kind of force. It was a communist insurgency that they tried to take power in the 1980s. And they ended up being defeated by a very populist but right-wing political figure, and again, not the figure himself didn't defeat them, but under the rule of this populist, but democratically elected initially Peruvian leader named Alberto Fujimori, and this guy was somebody who, um, if he wasn't, an authoritarian, he had, authoritarian tendencies. I would classify him as an autocrat or an authoritarian ruler because he ended up doing away with the Constitution and with and so he ended up
Yeah.
basically doing some things that made him more of an authoritarian than when he started.
So yes, I have some interesting questions around authoritarian figures later, but I wanted to concentrate a little bit more on your actual work and research you've done. And a lot of your work is very on the ground, very face to face, very village to village. But there are all these broader forces at play on the global stage. And one of the things that impresses me about what you do is your concern and interest in people and communities. Um, Explain and describe your methodology and what draws you to that methodology.
Yeah, so I think I'm a historian, and that's my training. That's what I teach. That's what I do in terms of my methodology. But I also, like many historians, am try to think about kind of interdisciplinary way of doing things. And I was fortunate enough to be trained also at the University of California, San Diego, to do ethnographic research. And I had an advisor there, Nancy Postero, who actually just retired this year, but was a phenomenal, and is a phenomenal anthropologist who really taught me about kind of really thinking about ethnography and culture in ways that I didn't necessarily think about just going into the archives. And so that allowed me to bring a sort of human element to where I can go into communities and spend real time there, kind of living in different villages in the Andes, kind of talking to people and interacting with people in in urban environments, in the jungle and the Amazon. And so, yeah, that's really informed the kind of the way that I go about doing research. It's not just looking at newspapers and archives, but that's a big part of it for sure. But it's also really kind of human centered, and it's about really having relationships even with the subject who I'm studying.
You also do something that we kind of shun and reject, which is humanizing terrorists, or what some people call terrorists. Why do you do this? How do you do this?
I mean, it's certainly something I strive to do. I don't know if how successful I am. I think sometimes I'm more successful than others, but that is really the goal. And it's not to necessarily be even sympathetic toward what people call consider terrorist organizations, uh, or to justify it, or
Yeah.
to engage in in Spanish what's called apología or apologia, not to apologize for it, but to try to really explain it and understand what makes people who again are described by the state as terrorists, what makes them tick, what motivates them, why do they get into this action, what makes somebody decide to go from point A, which is sitting in your house taking classes, thinking about things, to point B, which is taking up arms and being willing to kill or be killed for an idea. And that's something that has really motivated me as somebody who, my family is from Peru, and we would go visit my family in Peru, my extended family in Peru, growing up when I was a kid during the kind of height of the political violence there. So that was probably something I always saw but didn't fully understand. And so I think, as I started going to college and stuff, I started really asking myself, why would somebody do this thing that my family considers to be terrorism? Why would they decide to do that? And just try to really understand that, and that could, in some ways, lead to a more humanized study of the past.
So when you start talking about individuals and start to make this connection to authoritarianism, what's the connection, if any, between their authoritarian goals of leaders and the sort of populist rhetorical principles they're espousing, right? There's almost a contradiction there a little bit, where, especially when you're talking about communism as being everyone's equal, there's this rhetoric, right? But then there's this, it is also innately sort of authoritarian. So what is that? How does that reconcile itself when people are getting other people to take up arms uh, against a government?
Yeah, so there, I think that's a really interesting question. Is like kind of where's that intersection between leader and led kind of where is that point of intersection? And that's something that definitely fascinates me and that I've dedicated my career to trying to really understand. And that is both from sort of maybe charismatic
Mhm.
kind of autocratic leaders on the left who maybe don't necessarily have power uh, to people on the right who oftentimes do end up taking power. And why? Like, why would somebody end up supporting them? And when, like you said, it seems so obvious to many outside observers that individual is out for personal gain.
Yes. Yeah.
And so how can they get people to like basically do their bidding and risk life and limb to support them? And that's something that is really fascinating. And I think a lot of it has to do just just frankly with the charisma of the individual. I think charismatic leaders have a real a real power and allure
Mm.
that is really something that is intangible. And we don't really understand it. We can't really put our finger on it, but we're attracted to these figures. We want to see them speak more. We
Mm.
want to be near them. We want to be in their presence. We want to read what they write. There's something about the figure itself. So I do think that it tends to be something that charismatic leaders tend to be very good at. But also it's something where the leader themselves are really savvy at actually um, really showing how their personal goals and their ambitions align with, or at least convincing their followers that they're in alignment with actually the goals and ambitions of the people that they're leading. And when you see the charismatic leader able to articulate that alignment, that's when you see people
Mm.
really starting to flock toward them, and that's when people will do things like suspend their disbelief,
Yeah.
outright lies that we see that how can anybody not see that that's a lie? That's when people are willing to actually kind of put things like reason and critical thinking aside in order to actually to really follow that leader. So I think that's a lot of how we see it. It's the alignment of the charismatic leaders' goals of personal ambitions with the kind of the sort of collective desire of the people who are following.
So speaking specifically about the Shining Path, and again, my limited amount of research and understanding, but as a leftist communist force, it didn't seem like it was about engaging and organizing on this in the civil realm, and that it leaned into violence and saw war as the means for change or revolution and to reach communist rule. How accurate is that statement, and what makes it is that unique? Um, well, let's just start. Is that an accurate statement that violence was its primary weapon?
I would say yes. I think that is accurate to say that they did not engage in sort of like, you know, the sort of like kind of what you might call democratic forms of organization. They didn't necessarily believe in participating in elections. In fact, they actually were violently opposed to them. They did not necessarily believe in actually engaging in kind of civic discourse. Those are not things that they believed were actually even mm, useful. They thought that they were actual, bourgeois distractions from the thing that they were trying to accomplish. So they did use violence as a weapon, but I would say probably the bigger weapon that they believed that they were really using was the kind of weapon of ideas,
Mm.
and they believed that ideas were something that could be, once someone buys into an idea, that you have that person for life. It's hard to change their idea when they really believe it, to their core. And so I think that what they did was they used ideology as a way to really hook people into that be their principal weapon. And of course, that was supported through guns and cannons, as they like to say.
So parse for me the difference and connection between potential for violence, the threat of violence, and then the use of violence. Are they on a continuum? I'll let you answer that. What are sort of the difference between the potential for violence, the threat of violence, and then the use of violence or force?
So I would say we take like the moment we're in right now in the United States in 2024. Election season, presidential election. I think that we are in a moment right now where there is a potential for violence. There are isolated cases of violence that we see. We saw that one of the candidates there was an assassination attempt. So violence was actually attempted against Trump's life, which was very real. But aside from those isolated cases, we see an extreme potential for violence as we start to see a base of supporters for that same candidate feeling incredibly aggrieved, incredibly jaded, and incredibly I guess and feeling an incredible loss of control also. And so that's the potential.
Let me interject, because then if we look back in hindsight and you have actual violence in two instances I'll make as examples. One is the occupation of Michigan State Capitol, right, in 2020. Yep. Actual violence, occupation, armed occupation, no lives lost or anything. And then January 6th, right? So two sort of events that aren't really, actually, I wouldn't say unprecedented in American history, but unprecedented in modern American history. So they sort of create a different sort of backdrop for if there's a gauge between potential for violence and threat. How does the threat of violence play into politics when you have also members of the Republican Party and elected officials afraid of their own base? Right? So are we at a little bit further of a tipping point than we might really be aware of on an everyday basis? And is our memory too short to remember that these election officials are threatened, judges are threatened? So I'll let you answer the question again in a different way. Where are we? Are we closer to the threat of violence than just the potential for violence?
I think that we are, again, they're kind of, it ebbs and flows. So certainly, but often, not always the case, because a lot of times violent movements are very, very well planned and coordinated. And so, but I will say that to go from potential to sort of threat, and oftentimes there has to be a trigger, and there has to be an opportunity for violence. And there's always opportunity for violence, but so there's potential right now, I believe, and that could quickly trigger to opportunity for violence. One opportunity was the assassination attempt against Donald Trump. That now was a violent act by the person who actually ended up being taken out and killed during the act. But that then could give people cause to then say, now we feel like they drew first blood. So anything that we do is justified. Anything that we do, and I'm not saying that this is happening right now, but I'm saying that kind of is where we could see the move from potential, I think, to threat. And it's saying, now we can start organizing, we can start thinking about what we're going to do to respond to this if Trump doesn't win, or if Trump does win. They do first blood. They're not playing fair. They bring whatever the enemy is, the opposition, and so there could be a real potential for violence. And then from that to happen, and from potential to actual, or I guess you should say threat of violence. For to go from threat to actual violence, all that takes is one action, and then that could be isolated. And you hope that if there is any kind of violent action that is isolated, or it could actually kind of cause a wellspring of violence, which is always so we're kind of thinking about the direction that we could be going in. So I'd say it's still potential. I'd say that, but there are kind of moments where it becomes threat, and then from those moments we can see it actually, depending on people kind of act on it, it quickly descending into actual violence.
So, in the United States, we've always had this sort of element of terror. I give the Ku Klux Klan as an example.
Mhm.
Post-war, very well organized, very well politically attached in a lot of ways. But what you seem to be saying is that the real key to drying the powder in the powder keg is organization. There needs to be sort of almost waiting in the wings, something waiting for the excuse, right?
Oftentimes, yes, that's oftentimes when you see people take like the many of the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, they were already organizing these
Yeah.
kind of right-wing militias, for example, these kind of groups that were already very prone to violence, and that gave them
Hmm.
the excuse to go from the threat to actual violence. Doesn't always have to be the case. Sometimes that's what I'm talking about. There could be a triggering moment. January 6th could have easily descended into a civil war. Fortunately, that didn't happen, and it ended up being isolated, and we didn't see a whole lot of evidence of that kind of taking spreading like wildfire. Although we did see people occupying buildings and government buildings and threatening to do that afterwards. It ended up being maintained, but I feel and contained. But I do think that it could be sometimes in history you see events that are like, again, this kind of group waiting to take advantage of those kind of moments, or you see moments actually descending into actual kind of widespread violence also. But oftentimes, as you said, there are groups that are organized, that are kind of waiting for the right moment to actually make their move, and they oftentimes will take advantage of a more widespread organic sort of movement.